Welcome to the 700 Club, and thanks for joining us. For 11 days, Hamas and other terror groups fired thousands of rockets into Israel. But Israel faces another enemy with far more powerful weapon. That enemy is Hezbollah.
They could strike Israel with missiles in a war that would be much more devastating than the battle against Hamas. Chris Mitchell brings us this look at why Hezbollah is such a deadly threat.
I have to admit that as an Israeli, this is not the only front that I'm concerned of. I look north and I see Lebanon and I see Hezbollah.
Counterterrorism expert Boaz Ganor tells CBN News Hezbollah and its estimated 150 to 200,000 missiles represents a far greater threat than Hamas.
If you ask me what concerns me with Hezbollah, everything that concerned me with Hamas, but big time, much more than what we had.
After studying the recent war, Ganot believes Hezbollah would try to overwhelm Israel's #1 defense, the Iron Dome. Ganot also points out Hezbollah possesses not just rockets, but missiles.
What's the difference between a missile and a rocket? A missile is a guided rocket. You can guide it, you can direct it to the targets. So there they have guided missiles with much, much bigger warheads, and they cover all the territory of Israel. They can launch rockets from Lebanon and hit Eilat, which is the most southern part of Israel.
CBN News has reported on Hezbollah's facilities inside Beirut that convert its rockets into guided missiles. It's all part of a multi-billion-dollar Iranian project.
Iran have built this enormous capability for one purpose, and in my view, one purpose only: to deter Israel from attacking the nuclear facilities that they build in Iran.
Ganor, like most Israelis, takes Iran at its word regarding the desire to eradicate Israel.
They are saying that loud and clear. Once they can meet their ideological goals with practical capabilities like a nuclear bomb, that's an existential threat to Israel. You should bear in mind how small Israel cannot observe one nuclear bomb and recover out of it.
Ganor says Hezbollah represents an unprecedented challenge to Israel and that any war against it would dwarf the recent conflict with Hamas.
I believe that Hezbollah would cause much more damage and much more casualties in the numbers of hundreds, if not thousands. In that case, no doubt in my mind that the Israeli government and the Israeli military and the Israeli public would expect the Israeli government to do whatever they can in order to prevent those atrocities against Israel in a much lesser restrictive manner than Israel done in Gaza.
While the U.S. seeks to re-enter the Iranian nuclear deal, the chief of the UN nuclear watchdog says Iran is now enriching uranium at levels only reached by countries seeking atomic weapons. As that clock speeds up, it could be just a matter of time until Israel sees this northern border threat come to fruition. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, the danger for Israel has literally never been greater. I mean, you can go back to 48, where 5 Arab nations declared war against her. You can go back to 67. You can go back to Yom Kippur. It just seems that there's always this agitation. But in the current one, all roads lead back to Iran. Iran is funding Hamas. Iran's the financial partner as well as the intelligence partner for all of the rockets that were fired against Israel. And here, what they're doing with Hezbollah, they're heavily armed with guided missiles, and then they have entrenchments, these tunnel networks throughout southern Lebanon that would absolutely hinder Israel's military trying to stop rocket fire. They wouldn't be able to come in with a ground offensive in order to protect their own civilians. If there was ever a time to pray for Israel, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, well, it's today. In other news, Americans are getting ready for the summer, and many are hoping they won't have to worry about COVID. John Jessup has that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
Thanks, Gordon. This weekend marks the unofficial start of summer, and all indications show Americans will be traveling once again. Still, while many are putting the coronavirus behind them, Others here in Washington are looking to where the virus came from in the first place. CBN News medical reporter Lori Johnson has the story.
37 million Americans plan to travel this Memorial Day weekend. That's up 60% over last year when the nation was in the grip of the pandemic. Still, the number of Americans traveling this year is lower than pre-pandemic levels. National Institutes of Health Director Dr. Francis Collins told CBN News that while it's safe for vaccinated Americans to finally let down their guard, he said those who haven't been immunized are still at risk of getting infected and passing it on to the vulnerable.
There are people because they have cancer and they're on chemotherapy, or maybe they've had a kidney transplant. For them, the vaccine doesn't work because their immune system is not able to respond to it. So they're going to be still really vulnerable if this virus is circulating. The best way to keep it from circulating is for the rest of us who have effective immune systems to get vaccinated.
After the number of people getting shots dropped, Ohio's vaccination rate shot up 45% thanks to their vaccine lottery in which this woman won $1 million and this teen a full ride to college. Now other states and businesses are offering similar incentives.
If this is getting their attention, I'm all for it.
New research suggests people who recovered from the virus who were also vaccinated may achieve lifetime immunity. Those who were vaccinated but never infected and those who were infected but never vaccinated likely have limited immunity and will need a booster shot.
And will that be like once a year, once every 2 years, once every 5 years? Some of that's also going to depend on these variants.
When it comes to the origin of the pandemic, Dr. Collins supports an investigation into a possible leak from the lab in China, but believes animal-to-human transmission is more likely based on precedent.
That's how Ebola happened. That's how HIV happened, coming from an animal to a human. That's how Zika happened. That's how SARS, another coronavirus, and MERS, both of which originally started in bats.
Collins says the world may never know how the coronavirus began, in part because of China's refusal to allow a timely and thorough investigation. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
Thanks, Lori. Well, President Biden is releasing his first budget today. The $6 trillion price tag marks historic levels of spending. And even with major tax increases, it also includes a huge $1.8 trillion deficit. CBN's Jennifer Wishon has this look at what's inside the president's spending plan.
President Biden is proposing spending the U.S. hasn't seen since World War II. Biden previewed his plan at a community college in Cleveland, calling on record spending to keep up with countries like China and Japan.
We must be number one in the world to lead the world in the 21st century.
His spending plan hikes taxes by more than $3 trillion by raising the corporate tax rate, increasing capital gains rates on top earners, and raising income taxes on the wealthy, saying he's focusing on those in the middle and lower income ranges.
The best way to grow our economy is from the bottom up and the middle out.
Still, the New York Times reports he lets Trump-era tax cuts for low earners and the middle class expire in 2025, although those cuts could be extended in the future. His plan includes free preschool for all 3- and 4-year-olds, 2 years free community college for all Americans, subsidized childcare, and a national family and medical leave program. It also incorporates his $1.7 trillion infrastructure plan that Republicans continue to counter.
We're not raising taxes. We believe that the 2017 tax reform contributed significantly to enabling us to achieve the best economy of my lifetime. And that's no small thing.
The president's budget is just a proposal. It has to get through Congress. And with big spending and deficits over $1 trillion every year, it's sure to face criticism from Republicans. Some Democrats are likely to have concerns, too. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News.
Thank you, Jennifer. And with these projected deficits, Gordon, the national debt could reach around $40 trillion within a decade.
And that number is absolutely unimaginable. And just start thinking about what the interest payments on $40 trillion are going to be. Forget trying to pay that off. You're talking multiple lifetimes to pay it off. But just the interest alone, when you look at 40 trillion, what's 1% of that, or 2%, or 3% on an interest rate, and you start to get to whopper numbers that will absolutely swallow up the federal budget. And how do we pay for all of that? And how do we even just pay for the interest payment? What's going on is something called new money theory, and this is bipartisan, if you will. Vice President Dick Cheney was famous for saying deficits don't matter. AOC and saying where's the money going to come from? Well, we're going to rely on new money theory. What that means is the federal government goes out and borrows from the federal government. It's just changing hands, and you're not really monetizing your debt. You're just racking up a ledger that we essentially owe ourselves. And so the theory is, if it gets too big, well, you just forgive the debt. And you're not doing anything to bond markets, and you're not doing anything to foreign borrowers. This all gets really complicated because at some point in time, we have to wake up that this really doesn't work. You can talk about new money theory all you want, but it goes away when the U.S. dollar is no longer the reserve currency. We're already seeing digital currencies on the rise. At what point do they take over? And if they do take over, what does that mean for our own deficit? Here's something I know from history. You go back to the Greek city-states. When a city, when the population of the city, the people that voted for the government, when they figure out they can vote themselves the treasury, so you start paying yourself, you start getting stimulus checks, you start expecting all kinds of handouts from the government, you start living that way. Instead of living on your own earnings and your own ingenuity, you start relying on the government for things. When that happens, it's not too much longer before the Treasury runs out. You run out of money. You can't give yourself a stimulus payment anymore. And what happens after that? Well, the city goes bankrupt. And when that happens, the very next thing is a dictator. A tyrant comes in, promising, I'll solve all your problems. I'll continue whatever it is you need. I'll take care of you. But in exchange, you have to give up your liberty. We're spending ourselves into a hole at 40 trillion. It's now impossible to pay it off. And what happens next? Well, you're going to see a tyrant.